I think you're going to enjoy this morning's meeting. This is kind of a unique opportunity because oftentimes asking a senior official to leave Washington for a while is not always easy. But we're fortunate in this regard, and that is that the FAA Administrator Michael Huerta, who's with us today, has been from the beginning very engaged and very accessible to the general aviation community. We at Redbird have had the chance to have FAA officials join us. We had Jim Viola, I think a couple years ago. We've had Deputy Administrator Mike Whitaker actually come through our facilities here and fly the Red Hawk. You just saw the promotion there. And Mike Whitaker, as a Deputy Administrator, has actually become a private pilot. So there's many things to focus on at the FAA, but at the leadership level, we've had people that have had a pretty steady focus on general aviation from the beginning. You know, you all run organizations, and in government, one of the things that I've always found so remarkable is how fast people turn over. You know, they might stay in government, but they move from job to job. Indeed, at the White House, it's about 18 months, so you don't have much tenure. People just go quite a bit. And at the FAA, the term for the administrator is 5 years, but so many of these things, as you know, take time to work through a process of 2 or 3 years, and so 5 years goes by pretty fast. We're fortunate that for an agency that spends about $16 billion, has 47,000 employees, not just mostly across this country, but also abroad, doing a lot of work internationally on behalf of our aviation community. We're fortunate that Michael Huerta, after spending time in transportation roles from Boston to San Francisco, ran the Olympics with Mitt Romney for a while in Salt Lake City, served in the Department of Transportation as Chief of Staff to the Secretary, so the agency that houses, if you will, the FAA was a place he had some perspective on. We're fortunate that in 2010, he was asked to serve as the Deputy Administrator, and he was there when the Administrator left and he became the Acting Administrator. And in January 2013, he was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate. That was unanimous. This is something we don't see in Washington. Unanimously confirmed as the Administrator for a 5-year term, which gives him more time and tenure in office than virtually any FAA Administrator. I call it tenure. He sometimes refers to it as a sentence, but we don't want to give him any time off, even for good behavior, because we do appreciate working with him. He's very familiar with Redbird. He was here yesterday afternoon. Some of you saw him in a simulator. We're going to let him log the time. He did a very nice landing. And I want, without any further ado, to ask him to come on stage. Please welcome FAA Administrator Michael Huerta.
Okay. Well, good morning, Redbird. And thank you, Craig, for that introduction. What Craig did not tell you is Craig is actually spending a lot of time with us at the FAA as a volunteer. He serves as the Vice Chair of the Administrator's Management Advisory Council, which is a group of individuals across aviation that advise the Administrator on the business side of what's going on in our world, and serves as, I think, an important voice of what's happening out in the industry that we as an agency need to deal with. Craig will also tell you that when I first asked him to join the MAC, I said, Craig, it's 3 meetings a year, come on. You know, you can have time, you can certainly fit that into your schedule. And Craig, about how many hours have you put into your...
It's the weekly calls and visits to 800 Independence. But it's enjoyable.
He's actually made it into a full-time job. And Craig, thank you so much for your dedication to the work of the Management Advisory Council. You know, there are many ways that people find their careers. Mine has been a little bit of an accident. As I've moved through what have been, you know, just an amazing set of wonderful career opportunities, working in great cities like New York and San Francisco, working on great events like the Salt Lake City Olympics, and now this wonderful challenge of leading the FAA. And what I think is a critical time in its history. Accidents might play a part in where we wind up in our careers, and luck often plays an important part of where we wind up in our careers. But in aviation, what I am most struck by, particularly in the pilot community, is that passion is the initial factor that brings people into aviation. You know, with the FAA, the thing that I'm most impressed with is, I've been in a lot of different places, but there are a few places where you see the passion for aviation that we have in the FAA. I'd like to talk about one of our colleagues. Lynn Lunsford is a public affairs manager here in the Central States region. He's based in Fort Worth. Lynn is a pilot. He offered to fly me down here from Washington in his vintage 1938 Piper Cub, which I would have done had I had 2 weeks to make the trip. Next time, Lynn. You know, it's fairly obvious where this all begins in aviation. I've heard stories of a kid at an air show, and I was one of those kids when I was growing up, standing outside an active airfield where I was hanging out by the boundary fence. I was delivering newspapers at the time. It was an evening newspaper in Riverside, California, and my customers always got their newspaper late because I was much too focused on what was going on at that airfield. But when you're there, you could be watching anything from the Thunderbirds to a Cessna, but they all catch the same bug, all of us, a lifelong fever that in many respects is incurable. And once we all show the symptoms, such as looking up at the sky when we hear the sound of an engine, annoying disinterested people by explaining the differences between props and jets, and my 19-year-old son is expert at that, and talking with their hands to describe their last adventure, I think that the people in this room, all of you, represent that next stop that these that are caught with the bug take. How many times have you heard the phrase when a student comes to see you, "I've always wanted to do this"? Well, you are their true introduction to aviation. The job of an instructor with new pilots, is to get their heads out of the clouds so they can fly safely in the clouds. And while that goal hasn't changed a whole lot since the early days, the standards of how we train pilots have changed quite dramatically. An early pilot who transitioned from tactical ballooning to fixed wing in 1909 was U.S. Army Colonel Frank Lamb. His instructor was a pilot with a relatively few hours. His name was Wilbur Wright. Lamb described the instruction in great details. It was 3 hours of duel, followed by a solo, and then he was allowed to carry passengers. Now, education has become a little more comprehensive since then, but the flight instructor is still the most important person in any pilot's career. You nurse, you encourage, and sometimes you cajole the best from your students. And they will never see you wince if their first solo landing bounces enough times to count as their second, third, and fourth landing. You are page 1 of their flight logs, and however many pages and books they go through, you will always be judged by how well they do. Now, the times have changed a bit since Colonel Lamb completed his first solo. We all know that pilots are better trained, airplanes are infinitely improved over the wing warping biplanes of 1909, and the sky is an incredibly safe place to be. And yes, there are perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 or a few more regulations. But not only is the aviation industry safer, the aerospace industry is a critical national asset to we as Americans. It contributes between 12 and 13 million jobs and about $1.5 trillion to our national economy. And aviation and aerospace products constitute our nation's largest form of export. Now, closer to home, although the number of pilots with active certificates has slightly declined, you might be pleased to know that there are more qualified flight instructors than ever, more than 100,000 of you as of 2014. And on the ground, non-pilot professions have also seen very steady growth. Our commercial air carriers move close to 750 million people a year in a system that is safer than it has ever been. But there are still far too many incidents and fatalities in the general aviation community, and we have to continue to focus on efforts to reduce those numbers. Rarely does a week go by that we don't have at least one GA fatal accident somewhere in the United States, and we're working with every aspect of the aviation industry to reduce risk in GA flights. Now, as flight instructors and flight school operators, you believe there's always room for improvement. It's never too late to sharpen skills and to learn new techniques. And although we've improved safety in the national airspace system, we're always looking for new ways to reduce risk. Toward this end, we as an agency are moving away from the perception that we're solely a reactive regulatory and enforcement agency. And with industry partners, we've already started following the concept that we call safety-based systems as part of our risk-based decision-making initiative. Although there will always be a place for lessons to be learned as the result of an accident, we want to find ways to prevent that first domino from falling. Risk-based decision-making is designed to identify, to assess, and to mitigate the risk that we know is in the system before a problem can become an incident or an accident. Now, we find ourselves in a golden age for commercial aviation. Luck didn't get us here. There was effort, determination, and cooperation between every facet of the aviation industry. We've eliminated most of the traditional causes of accidents and incidents, such as wind shear and controlled flight into terrain. And what's left are those minor flaws or omissions that weren't noticed or weren't reported that could snowball into a tragic event. While it's natural to assume that mistakes will happen in today's complex aviation environment, the FAA recently announced a new compliance philosophy that is designed to shine a light on those problems before they can result in an accident or an incident. Our goal is first to find and fix a problem, then to learn from it, and to share information to prevent a repeat occurrence. Now, to do this, we need to have something that's really important, and that is trust, open communication, and cooperation between all aspects of the industry. Both companies and individuals must have an environment where they can disclose honest mistakes, failures, and procedural errors. And both regulators and operators must understand the difference between accountability, which accepts responsibility and looks forward, and blame, which focuses on punishment for what has already happened. Now, in such cases, we use tools like training or documented improvements to procedures to remediate problems. And employers must foster an environment that educates and expects employees to be proactive in identifying risks and challenges in the system. With the creation of better procedures, employees feel more accountable, and they're better able to recognize and report on potential problems that might exist in the system. We've started compliance philosophy education for all FAA employees with a detailed how do I implement it training for each of our lines of business. For example, we want inspectors to use their judgment, their experience, and their expertise and qualifications to identify risk and to work with individuals or operators to identify the most appropriate tools needed to permanently fix problems. Additionally, inspections will continue, though now they are data-driven and not date-driven. Safety depends on compliance, so we do not tolerate people who intentionally ignore, deceive, or fail to comply with regulatory standards. We will deal with them as needed and apply enforcement as needed. But at the same time, it is important to recognize those organizations that have a strong safety culture and are taking steps to ensure that they're mitigating risk in the system. There is an adage that we all learn from our mistakes, and I want us to learn from small mistakes to avoid having to learn from larger ones. We believe the compliance philosophy is the evolutionary thinking that we need to make flying even safer. Now, while compliance is intended to prevent future incidents and to foster trust, there are other ways to ensure safety as well. You're well aware that we're rewriting our Part 23 regulations, which form the basis for certifying small aircraft. We want to increase safety, we want to certify more efficiently, and help industry reach the market with innovative technologies and innovative products. In the past, we regulated the design and the product. In the future, we will define the safety parameters we wish to achieve, leaving the industry free to approach product design to the best of their abilities. Now, this rule change will be very, very different. It's a major shift in regulatory policy. Rather than prescribing the exact technical details of how an airplane should be built, the rule will lay out the performance standard that it needs to meet, and it is left to the manufacturer to determine how best to meet them. Our team is working overtime to get this done right, and it is something that we are anxious to have out for public comment later this year. Now, flight school has traditionally been the takeoff point for entering our national airspace system, and unfortunately, this is not the case for an increasing number of new operators in the national airspace system. And of course, you know who they are. Those are the users that are flying unmanned aircraft. The vast majorities of these users have no concept of the existence of a national airspace system, how to safely operate within it, and this is becoming an ever-increasing safety problem for all of us. Despite this, I do believe that most incidents are a result of ignorance rather than malice. Although the present regulations state that drones should not be flown within 5 miles of an airport, we're seeing reports of UAS on short final to major airports, or at altitudes of thousands of feet, which is far higher than the 400 feet that we currently allow. Many UAS operators may be unaware of how common and close airports can be. For example, apart from the airport we find ourselves at here today, there are 11 other airstrips scattered about Hays County. 2 weeks ago, Secretary Fox and I announced that the FAA is going to require operators to register their unmanned aircraft. I believe that registration will instill a sense of accountability and a sense of responsibility to the operator, but it also provides us an important opportunity. It's an opportunity to educate operators about airspace rules so that they can use their unmanned aircraft safely. And it will be a help in enabling us to identify and to take enforcement actions against people who don't obey the rules and operate safely. At the same time, we are finalizing our rulemaking for small unmanned aircraft, those that are under 55 pounds. But while we are finalizing the rule, we're using our existing authority to accommodate requests for commercial operations. To date, we've approved about 2,200 exemptions that allow unmanned aircraft to be used for such things as power line inspections and agriculture. And through our program that we call Pathfinder, we're working with industry to determine how to safely expand unmanned aircraft operation beyond the parameters of our proposed rule. Education is also extremely important. We at the agency and our partners continue to conduct outreach campaigns through a program we call Know Before You Fly. We've been working with manufacturers, we've been working with users to help educate new unmanned aircraft operators about what the rules of the sky are. And we've also had a number of no drone zone campaigns, the first of which we launched during last year's Super Bowl, and the most recent of which was the recent visit of Pope Francis. Yes, indeed, we did declare the Pope to be a no drone zone. And we had an interesting conversation with the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which was hosting the Pope, and also happens to own a drone with a GoPro camera attached to it. We've partnered with the San Francisco 49ers football team, and they produced a public service announcement that runs on the team's scoreboard during home games. And we're also testing a new smartphone app, Before You Fly, which allows UAS operators to conveniently compare their location in relation to airspace. You turn on your phone, bring up the app, and it tells you what the restrictions are, exactly where you're standing for operating an unmanned aircraft. But we do realize that education and outreach are, while they're an important tool, they're not always the only tool and the most effective tool. Enforcement is always an option. Last month, we proposed a $1.9 million civil penalty against a company that knowingly conducted dozens of unauthorized flights over the cities of Chicago and New York, despite being repeatedly warned that that was not something that was allowed. And so the message is clear: operate within the law, or we'll take enforcement action. We're not interested in stifling innovation, but we're never going to compromise on safety. Working together with all interests, we're confident that we can find a balance, that we can balance both innovation with safety and ensure that our airspace always stays safe. Now, it's often said that one should never stop learning. And for those of you out there that are the more seasoned instructors, change is just part of the industry. I'm sure that some remember Loran, still enjoy VORs, and are wondering when iPads became a mission-critical instrument. But the students you are teaching will, of course, learn charts and learn dead reckoning, but they will also be an important part of the next generation. And today we're seeing a lot of positive results of our next-gen modernization. Earlier this year, we completed the foundational platform for next-gen through the installation of a new technology platform in the en route environment. It's running at all 20 of our continental en route control centers. We've also completed the installation of the ground stations for ADS-B, giving airmen better situational awareness and a clearer picture of weather and other traffic. By 2019, your students going to commercial carriers should be enjoying the nationwide benefits of the Datacom systems for high-flying traffic. While here in 2015, we've already completed the first two phases and upgrades of computers and displays that are used in the TRACONs and control towers. And our Metroplex Air Traffic Initiative is providing the benefits of performance-based navigation to reduce fuel costs and CO2 emissions by billions and billions of dollars. Now, despite generating future savings, these infrastructure investments come at a very significant initial cost. And that's a big challenge for all of us at the agency. The FAA is currently authorized through March of next year. And we have managed to weather a variety of short-term extensions, shutdowns, and sequestration. I've been with the agency for a little over 5 years, about 5.5 years, and in my tenure, we've had 23 short-term extensions, 2 shutdowns, and a government sequester. Now, these actions, as you can imagine, make it difficult to calculate what the agency's needs are with the consistency and stability that this vital industry needs. We can certainly do better than that. And there's also been discussion about restructuring the FAA as part of our next authorization. Should we corporatize or privatize air traffic? Should we consider a different structure for how we pay for the investments that are needed in the system? I've said many times that we're very, very open to having that conversation, but I think that the most important thing that reauthorization needs to fix is to provide the agency with stability, with adequate resources, and the ability to set priorities in order to respond to the ever-changing needs of the aviation industry. When we think about how far aviation has come in a century, in 1929, an organ builder in New York designed and built the first flight simulator, the Link Trainer. They put a couple of stubby wings on it, and it looked like one of those rides that you see outside of supermarkets or diners, but it got the job done. And today, we have full motion simulators with incredibly realistic graphics, but we all know that there is room for improvement and room for innovation. We're an industry that always wants to do more, to be better, to be faster, to be more efficient, and to be more reliable. Our part of the equation is to keep the system safe, but it's also a shared responsibility with all of you in this room and everyone working in this industry. And working together, I believe that this system, which represents the gold standard for safety and efficiency, will continue to be that for many, many decades to come. So I wish you the best of luck and best wishes for a continued Redbird migration. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael, for coming and for the comments. He's agreed to let me bore in a little bit on some of the topics he raised and maybe a couple he didn't, and also take some questions from you folks. Some of my Redbird colleagues will have a microphone, and we'll intersperse questions you have with a few of mine and the time we have remaining. I think I'd like to start with the compliance philosophy and raise it in the context that you've had the opportunity both at the Department of Transportation and now the 5 years at FAA to understand and really, I think, get your arms around this culture at the FAA that exists. And one of the things that, you're nice to mention the MAC that I serve on, one of the things we've worked on together is how to move this culture, to give them a greater sense of urgency, different ways of approaching it. And the compliance philosophy does that. For these folks, week after week, their interface is often the FSDO. So I guess maybe I'd like you to describe a little bit about how what you and the leadership team is doing in Washington, how it translates what they might see at the FSDO level where they're having the interface.
You know, that's a really good question. You know, I think part of it is the traditional things you would expect any organization to do. Yes, we're doing a lot of training. We're doing a lot of what if. You see this situation, how best to respond to it. And that is helpful, but I think the most important thing is to use very real examples of what our folks in the FSDOs or in any of our field organizations are dealing with time and time again. Craig, as you well know, I travel a lot, and one of the things that I try to do when I'm traveling is to visit many, many FAA facilities. And there have been a couple of funny stories that have come out of it. I visited FSDO in my hometown of Riverside, California, and I got there, and they said it was the first time the administrator had ever visited the Riverside FSDO. And I can't tell you how often that happens, that people in the field who are on the front lines feel very, very disconnected from what's coming from headquarters. And so all of us are trying very hard to have those discussions with the frontline folks that are out there. I've talked to a lot of aviation safety inspectors, to a lot of specialists and engineers in the field, and what I hear back, in response to the compliance philosophy is a couple of different things. The first is, okay, so that means we're not going to be doing enforcement. No. It means that enforcement is an important tool in the toolbox, but it's not necessarily where we need to start. Isn't it better for all of us if our enforcement resources are targeted where we're more likely to have problems? Second thing that we hear a lot of is, so you're saying we're not treating everyone the same. Exactly. It means that in organizations that have a strong safety culture, where they have appropriate procedures in place, and they're collecting data, they're sharing it, and they're developing, protocols to ensure that we're learning from situations, that is something that we need to recognize and to account for when we consider what our regulatory posture with respect to that individual organization needs to be. I think the thing that we all struggle with is though, when you're looking at data and you're trying to achieve compliance with the standard, you're taking a world which is very black and white. Checklist driven, you are or you are not doing what you need to do. And we're asking our inspectors now to interpret shades of gray. And what that tees up for them is the question is, okay, if you want me to exercise my judgment, how do I know that you are going to be standing behind me in the exercise of that judgment, and you're not going to beat me over the head if I get it wrong, or if I make a decision that's different from the decision that you might make? The way you address that from a cultural standpoint, the only way I know how to do it, is you just have to work it at a very granular level through the organization, talking to individuals. And as we learn more through the deployment of it, to make sure that what we are doing is broadening that conversation to include as many people as we can, which is also different. I think that it means that sharing of information means that no individual aviation safety inspector, should feel that he or she has the monopoly on all the answers. If you have a question, ask it, discuss it with your colleagues, and let's figure out what collectively is the best way to proceed there.
That's helpful, and it's welcome, and I think we see the change. We do see the changes coming. You had the chance to sit in a simulator yesterday. We had a presentation.
I didn't crash.
No, it didn't crash. Still works just fine. We had a presentation yesterday. It's a fascinating one where the speaker, who actually is in the soft drink business, but he talked about the importance of knowing your customer and building programs that reach your customer. And the one thing that I found a few years ago doing research when I was at AOPA was that the customer, the student, placed a high value on simulators. They placed the value there because they could work a problem, work a crosswind landing issue, 5, 6, 7 times sitting on the ground, or they could work on steep turns. We had a competition that showed people how fast they could learn, not only because they have a very accurate representation of the cockpit, but because that simulator in the Redbird device is a computer, so it can watch what they're doing, give them feedback. We see students come through here in 4 weeks off the street and be very competent to take their flight check as a private pilot. So we've talked about this before. I know you're aware of it, but our customer, the flight student, wants to be able to use the simulator, but they also want to be able to log that time. Mm-hmm. And it's an impediment if the government reduces their ability to do that. It's in two ways. It's an impediment to flight schools that are working on very tight budgets to invest in equipment if they feel the student isn't going to be able to log the time. And even though we can make the case the student gets through the flight training and has plenty of time in the airplane, even if they can't log the simulator time, it's an impediment. And I know the rule, I know there's some limitations, there's a proposed rulemaking on this, but I just hope that maybe you could give us a little update as to where that stands and what the time frame is for reducing the limitation on logging sim time.
Well, we had hoped, as you know, to get it out by the end of last year. We went to something which is highly unusual. It's called a direct final rule. And the hurdle you have to hit at a direct final rule is, which would have accomplished exactly what you wanted to accomplish. The hurdle you have to hit in a direct final rule is you put it out for comment for a period of time, and you have to receive no adverse comments. We received 2. And so what that requires us to do then is to open it up for public comment and to adjudicate those comments, and that's where we are right now. We did open it up soon after that for comment. We have received the comments. Since it's an open rulemaking process, naturally I can't talk in detail about, what the comments were, but I think that it is fair to say that there is very, very broad support for what we're trying to accomplish here. And so it's a question now of completing the rulemaking process and getting it out, and we're hopeful to do that as quickly as we can.
Thanks, and we'll keep working with you on it. If you have a question, raise your hand. A colleague will get to you in just a minute. I've got one area I'd like to delve into first, and it's one you didn't mention, and actually it's interesting because it used to come up all the time. It has to deal with fuel. Mm-hmm. You saw our Red Hawk aircraft. We have a diesel engine in that. It's working very effectively in the training environment. I know you're testing at the FAA these alternative fuels. I wondered what you see the future being for avgas, diesel. They're going to coexist. Is one going to go away? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think you know that EPA is very interested in phasing out all leaded fuels, and I think we have, as an industry, a very real challenge just as being kind of the only one that's out there. We're a pretty obvious target, and so that's what our research program, working cooperatively with industry, is all about. We did down select, and I think that we have some very promising research that's underway that is going to identify what is going to be a permanent replacement for avgas that's going to what we're trying to get to is a drop-in fuel that addresses the environmental problems. And I think that a lot of good work is going on in that area, and so I'm optimistic we'll be able to get there.
And you did really, and it was appreciated, assert the FAA's role in all of this, that flight safety is something that's in your sandbox, and EPA needs to understand that. So that's hopefully they'll wait until we get there.
We've actually had some very good discussions with them. I mean, yes, there is always just a natural tension that exists between agencies that have different regulatory interests and environments and that they're operating within. But I don't think that anyone in the EPA is interested in doing anything that is unsafe. But at the same time, they want to ensure that we as an industry are collectively doing what we need to do to move the fuel research program to an area where they can see an end of leaded fuels.
I think I saw a question down here. Jim, you want to kick us off?
Mr. Huerta, it doesn't take much to go through the aviation community and see that things are not great. If you look at the stats between the gravy days of 1979 to now, you see a significant diminishment in the power, strength, and well-being of aviation. The FBOs are struggling, the manufacturers are struggling, people who are in the aviation industry one-on-one are struggling. The jobs in some cases are disappearing. And there's no question that aviation could use a good shot in the arm somewhere, somehow. We're seeing innovators like Redbird and a number of others do amazing work in certain regards. But there's no question that the FAA and the regulatory burden placed on aviation is a significant thorn in our side. The question really is, and I realize this is kind of a softball to a certain extent, but is the FAA truly cognizant of the role that they play in the success of aviation, the role that they might play if they get off the bureaucratic mindset and start getting into the mindset that we saw some years ago when the FAA was a partner with aviation, when we truly were customers, and when in fact there is even a mandate to promote the business?
I think I'd want to start with the mandate that you talked about, which was removed in 1996. When the FAA was first established, we did have a very specific mandate to promote the interests of the aviation industry. And following a couple of horrific crashes in that year, there was a feeling on the part of Congress that it had gone too far. And so that mandate to promote aviation was explicitly removed. And today, we have it really for only one segment of aerospace, and that's commercial space. But for everything else, there is an outright prohibition on promotion of the industry. I think it is fair to say that in the past, the agency has interpreted that perhaps too rigidly. The example I'll give you is I was asked by a manufacturer's organization to provide a list of our contractors that we use to operate the air traffic control system, and they in turn would use that list, that we're suppliers to the FAA, in their marketing activities that they would take place throughout the globe, because, in their world, a supplier to the FAA is extremely important. And that created a whole lot of problems for a lot of people in the FAA. And, finally I had to get involved, and I said, guys, we're talking about a list. It is a list of who our suppliers are. This is factual information. This is not, we are not promoting any aspect associated with that. And so, I think it is fair to say that we have perhaps in the past adopted too rigid a point of view on that. But I want to go back to what I talked about earlier. It's through things like the compliance philosophy, through the NAC priorities, the Next Gen Advisory Committee priorities that we've been focusing on as we deliver performance-based navigation. What has certainly been a high priority for me are what are things that are high priorities for the industry that we work with. And, so Next Gen has got to be more about about more than just delivering technology platforms. It's actually got to be about delivering benefits and performance. So that's what we have been very, very focused on. Part 23, we could rewrite Part 23 just to clean up all the old language in there and to make sure that there aren't inconsistencies, but we've actually taken it a step further. What we wanted to do is to be a performance-based rule that gives, I think, the industry what it wants, which is regulatory flexibility to innovate. And that's a much harder thing for us to do, but it is something that we are very committed to doing. And so I think the short answer to your question is yes, we do understand the relationship that we have with the industry. And I think that we do recognize that in order to support the industry in the future, we have to change how we do business. And that's something that I'm very, very committed to doing.
Thank you. This one here.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I happen to be a major airline pilot, Part 121, and so my experience has been, with simulator technology, the implementation of simulator technology, varied maintenance schedules, line check airman type certification in the simulators, the use of an MEL. And I thought to myself, General Aviation is suffering with the economic conditions today. Why have we not implemented these same policies that air carriers benefit from that we cannot, just simply because certification stands in the way? I think that this would greatly benefit all of general aviation in this country, and it would advance, the safety throughout the system.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about certification of equipment for installation in general aviation, or what?
I'm talking about the policies, the FARs, that say that we can implement an MEL where it would be applicable. We could have rather than have 100-hour, you can say there's specific maintenance needs to be done throughout the year, just like the airlines do. Mm-hmm. You could do all the training in the simulator, then go out to the line, and get credit for all that time, just like we do at the airline.
Yeah.
All of that stuff it makes a lot of economic sense, which is why everything's done in-house at an airline. It saves us a lot of money there. Why can't we implement those same standards to a general aviation operation? You know, everybody here is, you know, we run flight schools, and we have to make money. We have to profit at this, or we won't do it.
Yeah, I think that I want to go back to, you know, Craig's question on how we're trying to change the rule with respect to flight simulator training. And this is one of the things that is actually a challenge for us. To change any rule is itself a rulemaking. No, seriously, that is, you know, what the Federal Administrative Procedures Act requires. And so even if it is relieving on industry, we still have to go through, you know, an extensive rulemaking process in order to do something which is relieving. And as you heard, there will be an adverse comment. You know, someone will say this is something that we shouldn't be doing. And what that, you know, the process is by its very nature designed to be very, very slow and very, very deliberative. Now, there are ways where we are able to address some things, and it's a fine line that we walk. It is through issuance of exemptions and waivers, you know, for particular types of activities, but the fine line we have to walk is we can't do rulemaking by exemption. That's a prohibition. So that means that we have to find distinguishing features about a particular case that might enable us to do something differently. The other thing that we've been doing with Congress is to get some help from Congress in terms of how it directs us to do rulemaking type activities, because if things are actually included, you know, with more specific direction, they become a whole lot easier. My nightmare scenario is getting legislation that basically says something like the administrator is hereby directed to promulgate a rule that takes into account these following general factors, which effectively is of no help, because all it basically says is open up a rulemaking process. But if I get something that, you know, constitutes, you know, Congress would like us to modify this particular section in a particular way, it becomes a whole lot easier. So it's something that we just need to continue to work on, but you know, it certainly takes a lot longer than I would like it to take. But changing any of these things, you know, in and of themselves are rulemaking activities.
Let me slip one in here, and we'll go back to the audience in a minute. We've talked a lot about what's happening on the ground, but of course everybody here operates in the airspace. And you've mentioned NextGen a few times. The NextGen Advisory Committee, the NAC, has done a lot of work with the FAA. One of the areas of concentration early on was the concept, building the concept around introducing new procedures into metroplexes. Yeah. We've been together in Seattle and Denver and other places, and we are now seeing the implementation. You know, and most of these folks operate either in or near a metroplex. If you haven't heard about new procedures in your metroplex, they're coming soon. There's actually on I put a plug in for the FAA website. It's actually extremely informative on a number of topics, this one being included. But share with us a little bit about how you're thinking about introducing these new procedures into the NAS, into the metroplexes, and how you address the whole notion of the airspace for general aviation, flight training, things like that.
Yeah, the Metroplex program represented a significant departure from how we would typically design navigation procedures. Typically, it was a very linear process. You know, air traffic would design a procedure, they would throw it over the wall to the facilities would test it, they would say it doesn't work, it would come back to the designers of it, and then it would finally get published, it would finally get implemented, and then we would hear from an adjacent airport, well, that doesn't work for us, because now you've just shut off access to one of my principal gateways through the use and deployment of that procedure. And then this was all being governed by a set of national policies that all procedures needed to conform to a set of basic and actually pretty granular guidelines of how navigation procedures would be deployed throughout the NAS. Metroplex did two things. The first thing that it did is greatly reduced the number of large national guidelines for the design of national or navigation procedures. The second thing is we considered an entire metropolitan area in its entirety and would look at redesigning airspace for that region. And so the idea was, two of the most successful have been here in Texas, where we launched Houston and Dallas. And we did a very significant redesign of the airspace that increased the throughput and capacity at the airports. It deconflicted arrivals and departures from adjacent airports, considered the needs of both general aviation and business aviation, as well as commercial carriers, and implemented everything all at once. And so what that gets you is a much more efficient system overall. Now, I think we've completed about a half dozen of these projects around the country. Seattle, Houston, Dallas, Northern California, Washington metropolitan area, and so on and so forth. We have several others that are in the works in Atlanta and Charlotte, Chicago, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Southern California, and elsewhere. And what we're finding is that a concern that I have that has started to emerge is public concerns about noise. And what's going on here is as we redesign airspace and make routes a whole lot more efficient, what we are doing is greatly reducing the number of people that are exposed to noise, but we are concentrating its impact over those that have it. And that raises some very, very challenging questions that we're dealing with in communities all across the country. Probably the most visible example of that has been down in Phoenix, where we designed a very, very efficient set of procedures, and we thought we were locating tracks over an industrial area, but we've been dealing with a lot of community concerns who are seeing aircraft closer than they might have seen them in the past. Likewise, in Northern California, where what we're seeing is a public sensitivity that's developing to aircraft, even if noise fits well below any federal guidelines in terms of needing to mitigate that. Aircraft flying at 11,000, 12,000 feet, we're getting noise complaints from communities that those aircraft are flying over. And so, I think this is something, we're doing an awful lot to make the airspace operate much more efficiently. I think that it is very important that the industry talk about the benefits of aviation, so that elected leaders in these regions are not only hearing from people that are extremely concerned about not wanting to see airplanes flying over their neighborhood. I think this has always represented a balance, and it's something that we need to continue to balance. But a lot of really, really good work is going on in deploying advanced navigation procedures, and users are saving a lot of money. I think that, when we turned on Houston Metroplex, we determined and we have validated about 3 million gallons of fuel savings in the Houston metropolitan area on an annualized basis, just on arrivals and departures. Dallas, about 4.5 million gallons of fuel savings. Washington, D.C., about 2.5 million gallons. Well, if you're starting in the millions and you're adding all that up, that is a huge, huge benefit to the users of the system. Of course, we're shooting ourselves in the foot on fuel tax collections that support the FAA.
But that's another issue. Okay, I'll ask you about that one too. I do want to say, though, that the good news about this Next Gen Advisory Committee that the FAA works so closely with in a lot of this is that it's well represented by business aviation, general aviation, manufacturers. And so these places like Seattle and Denver and other places that have very strong general aviation activity, they actually either do better or they do no worse, even when the airlines are flying much more efficiently into some of these places, and that's because of the collaboration that goes on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, you ask about Washington. I see this is going to be the lightning round because they were flashing. We've got just a few minutes left. I'll come to Washington in a minute. Let's go over here and we'll get a quick question in.
I have a question regarding our local FSDO. We're a 141 school that operates in Sarasota, Florida, and we meet all the requirements, in fact, significantly exceed all the requirements for exam authority. We've applied for that, and we've been told that they don't have the resources for that. That's not how I understand the process to work, and I'm not sure what our appeals process is at this point.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that situation, but we can just grab you afterwards and get the details of it, and we'll have somebody follow up.
The microphone, there, you got the microphone, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about your opinion on the impact of the ATP qualifications, how that was increased up to 1,500, and the effect that it's had on the training pipeline, as well as the, we're seeing currently the strong demand from airlines to have, qualified candidates for that.
Sure. I mean, that's, it's certainly been a difficult transition for the entire airline industry. To be clear, the law was passed by Congress that established the ATP requirement for a first officer, and then we promulgated a rule that allowed credit that could be applied against it for military and education to mitigate the impact of the hard 1,500-hour requirement. But it is a very, very significant change, and it is something that Congress intended when they enacted the legislation that forms the basis for that. Now, where it's really being felt is in the regionals, because the regional airlines are the ones that are, in many respects, the farm community for the mainline carriers. And I think that it's something they're all complaining about. And it is something that we have very limited ability to do anything about because the 1,500 is set in statute. And what our rule deals with is only how do we mitigate the impact of that. Some of the carriers are doing, I think, some interesting things. I talked with one in particular that is identifying promising candidates, and they're actually sponsoring them to obtain flight hours in other parts of the world, with the idea that then they now have a pipeline of people coming here into the U.S. I think it's something that's just going to take a number of years to work its way through the system overall. I know that there are some who would like to get the requirement changed, and in particular, RAA is pushing very hard for that. And we've been clear that if you want to get it changed, you have to get it changed legislatively because we do not have the flexibility to change it.
One question back there.
Good morning. I'm probably old enough to remember when you could walk into a flight service station, see a person, talk to him face to face. In today's information overload that we have, for example, on the flight service station standard weather briefing, I think there's something like 20 different tabs that you have to sort through. Has there been any thought given to perhaps going to something like video Skyping or something like that so that people can get a more tailored response to their weather briefings and things like that when they call flight service?
It's certainly something that we can look at. As you know, flight service is a business that we depend on third-party providers to provide to us. There are certainly things, with one exception, of course, Alaska. And I think that, there's probably a way to look at how we specify the requirements for how we provide that. It is part of, I think, a larger conversation that we would need to consider of, writ large, what would the industry be interested in seeing, in the way of modifications to that. But, I think you're asking a fair question. It probably is worth taking a look at. Is this really the most effective way to provide this information? I mean, I've looked at it myself, and I don't think it is. But, it's one of those things that we could probably do better on.
Michael, we've kind of reached the end of our time. Why don't I let you have the final word to this group of aviators and flight instructors from around the country?
You know, it's, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come today. I always enjoy any opportunity to get out of the confines of Washington, D.C., and to spend time talking with people that are actually dealing with the challenges that we have as an industry, but also represent what the future looks like in terms of where this industry needs to go and where it is going. I think that aviation, to me, has always been about two things. It's always been about how do we innovate as a society, how do we innovate as an industry, and how do we collaborate across all the segments of the industry and between the government and our private sector partners. And so that is something that I think is not really well understood by the public. This is an industry that has accomplished amazing things, and it's been because we have been able to find ways to deal with complex problems. That doesn't mean that we're always going to agree, but that collaboration, that discussion, that cooperation, and that willingness to share information, I think, is central to what this industry has always been about. It's something that I'm very committed to ensuring that we strengthen and build upon in the future. Thank you all again for the opportunity to be here.